David through his letters to the editor when I was opinion editor of the Gazette. I appreciate good writing, and those letters were well written. The same was true for the arguments he made. While passionate, they were always grounded in principle, reason, and logic, and above all, Article 14 of the New York State Constitution, which says the lands of the state are to be kept as wild forest lands, or the Forever Wild Clause, as it has come to be known. Nobody takes that commitment more seriously, tries to educate people about it, and hold decision makers to it than David. Whether he is opposing a development project, a land swap, a new road, or snowmobile trail, whether the advocates try using economic, historic, recreational arguments, he points out that Article 14 puts the environment first. If you want to do this, that, or the other thing on state land, the only way you can do it legally is by amending the state constitution. David was consistent with that commitment and message when he was executive director of the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks from 1987 to 2009. During that time, he was instrumental in securing Paul Schaefer's wonderful former self-built home on St. David's Lane in Niskayuna, which is now a research center and library owned by Union College, and I might add, managed on a daily basis by ECOS's own board member, Margie Amodio. David has also been consistent with that commitment and effort in his 11 years as managing partner of the nonprofit membership organization Adirondack Wild, Friends of the Forest Preserve, organized in 2010 and dedicated to stewardship of our wild lands, to safeguarding and educating about New York's forever wild legacy. David calls Adirondack Wild a conscience for the Forest Preserve. So now, mindful of the saying, let your conscience be your guide, let us welcome and give our attention to David Gibson. David?
Well, that's very generous, Art. Thank you. Thank you very much. I remember typing letters to Art. Do all of you remember typing your letters to the editor addressed to Art Clayman? Anyway, that's, how was my volume?
It's good, Dave, real good.
Thank you. Also, my first trip beyond the blue line was with ECOS. When you were, ECOS was sponsoring the stream ecology program at Camp Chinchacook. Mary was very kind, Mary McDonald and others, to invite me back then. And so that was literally my first trip into the blue line, past Lake George. So I owe a lot to ECOS. Well, I guess I will mention at the outset that this is a hybrid program that emphasizes history, and mostly the person that Art mentioned, of Paul Schaefer. And many of you know Paul and knew Paul, know his legacy at least, and have read his books, Defending the Wilderness, The Adirondack Writings of Paul Schaefer. I'm sure some of you have that book and have read it, or Adirondack Cabin Country. So I'm sure you're familiar with him, but I will review Paul's history and how it's relevant today. And that's my theme. So I better share screen and find out where I want to, where my program is. Oh dear. My first time doing this, I'm sorry. Is this showing? No. Is this slide up?
Yes, it is.
Oh, good.
Well, actually, it's your email.
Oh, how do I get rid of that?
So when you go, just do stop share and open up share screen again. Now you have a few things. If you go back down to the bottom Dave,
Yep.
the green share screen, and just do stop share and clear everything right out for a minute.
Stop share. Sorry about this.
That's okay. It should be down towards the bottom. Okay. Now go to share screen again, and you should get a screen that only you can see. And you want to click on the picture that has your presentation.
Got it. Thank you.
You bet.
So read it. I'm going to read it aloud for you.
And now we have it, Dave.
Okay, good.
Great job.
Well, I work with Adirondack Wild, as Art said. Adirondack Wild Friends of the Forest Preserve. You see our website. We started in 2010 as a new organization, or gave it new life. And the organization really dates to 1945. And we'll get into that history. So 2010, we're not a startup anymore, but it sure felt like that for a long time. Even though it was an incorporated organization, giving it new life took a lot of our energy and time over the past decade, but it's been worth it. And how do I advance here? Cindy, you know, how do I advance it? Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, our sole mission is to safeguard the wild. And, you know, the wild is defined by, to us, but not only by the Forest Preserve, but also by the wild private lands that abut the Forest Preserve. And not that they can't develop, but that they develop consistent with the Forest Preserve. And that's been the goal. That was the goal of the Adirondack Park Agency when it was created in law in 1971. Imperfectly followed, but that's the goal, and that is our mission, safeguarding the wild through advocacy and education. And pictured are Boreas Ponds, which is opened up to the public in 2017 for paddling and hiking, and a part of the High Peaks Wilderness. And then below, an example of our educational work, a panel that we were part of to debate the future management of Boreas Ponds in Schroon Lake. So that's our mission. And as you know, the Forest Preserve was created in 1885 in law in Albany. And the park was created, Adirondack Park was 1892, the Catskill Park not quite a decade later in 1904. And the constitutional protection for both of them began in 1895, actually 1894, and then implemented beginning in 1895 with these two sentences. As Art read some of them for you, 54 words, Article 14, Section 1 of our state constitution, unchanged since 1894. And you know those words. And if I was John Apperson, whose name is familiar to some of you, I'd require you to stand up and read these words out loud, but I'm not going to do that tonight. But they are pretty consequential words, every one of them. And Paul Schaefer believed fiercely in those words. He was born in 1908, and by 1945, a man in his 30s, he founded Friends of the Forest Preserve as an umbrella organization for anyone interested in protecting the Forest Preserve and really honoring the words of Article 14. This was long before APA, long before the State Land Master Plan, long before the State Environmental Quality Review Act. The modern environmental era was 30 years away, and Paul wanted to create this grand coalition on the private sector side to defend the Forest Preserve, and it needed defending in mid-century. We were after World War II had ended, and jobs were coming back, and Americans were coming home. And the motor vehicle and the off-road vehicle and the Jeep were in fashion in 1945, so people could get further in. And this was what Paul was worried about. And here's Paul as I knew him in the 1980s at his cabin in the Adirondacks. And so from 1945 to 55, I can't imagine the challenges that Paul Schaefer and his allies had to meet, because not only was the Jeep invading the Forest Preserve all over the place, and many other challenges, and there was no state money for land acquisition. for adding more forest preserve. But then the New York State decided to dam the Moose River and put all of New York State's political weight behind this project because hydroelectricity was needed for the Black River Valley, and this was going to be done. And the governor, the legislature, the attorney general, the State Water Power and Control Commission, and all of the forces that then existed put New York State's weight behind this project to build Higley Mountain and Panther Mountain Dam on the Moose River. And this became Paul's epic campaign for 10 years. Not alone, but he formed the coalition that defeated that. And today we have the Moose River Plains, right? 85,000 acres down this famous road from Inlet. And many of you have recreated, enjoyed the Moose River Plains ever since, but it would not be there without the work of the Moose River Coalition, 1945 to 55. And it would have looked not quite as big as Great Sacandaga Reservoir, but it would have been a large series of reservoirs on that river. And this is Great Sacandaga seen from Hadley Mountain, as familiar scene to many of you. So it was, it might have come to resemble this, and it certainly, as Paul would say, would have resulted in a fluctuating reservoir that to him was a cemetery of stumps and mud flats, not his idea of a wild river. And it wasn't just there, it was 25 other locations that the State Water Power and Control Commission and all these other forces wanted to build after World War II. Tremendous need for hydroelectricity, or perceived need for water. And of course, many of these were smaller dams, Timber Creek dams. They're built in the late 19th century, some of them. But what would have been built were much, much larger, as this diagram suggests, on all of these water bodies familiar to you. 13th Lake, Elm Lake, Kunjamak, Screwen Lake, Upper Hudson, Boreas Ponds. That little dam at the Boreas Ponds would have been much bigger. And all of them were on the boards, certainly on the drawing boards. And so we had Article 14, and it is a mystery to most people who learn about this history, how it could be done when you already have a constitutional mandate that the lands shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. Well, as you know, as some of you know, in 1913, there was an amendment to Article 14 to allow 3% of the forest preserve, 3%, to be used for, among other things, river regulation. River regulation. And of course, dam building and holding back water for storage for hydroelectricity is regulating streams. So 3%, that's a lot of the forest preserve. If you think about the forest preserve in those days, 1.25 million, 1.25 million acres, almost 2 million acres, 3% adds up to a lot of land that could be flooded, a lot of rivers. So that's why there was this exception. And Higley or Panther Dam on the Moose River would have put these waterways, the Indian River, which is comes into the Moose, Ice House Pond, which adjoins the Moose River, all of these pines and spruces that soar above these rivers 40 feet underwater, fluctuating all the time, 125 feet. And by the time Paul learned about this in 1945, 2,000 trees had been cut already. Bulldozers were in place. There were all sorts of no trespassing signs in place. Surveys was well underway by 1945. And imagine a man of Paul's understanding and sympathies for wild land coming upon this disaster that was in the making. He learned about it in New York City at a meeting attended by George Marshall, Bob Marshall's brother, and also a leader in the Wilderness Society in the United States. And George said, have you learned about the program of flooding the Moose River near Inlet? And Paul said, I know nothing about it, but I'd better find out. He left New York City in a hurry in his pickup truck, 1945, drove back to the city, probably in a snowstorm, and drove back to Schenectady and started getting to work. Meanwhile, he had a career, home building career. I don't know how he did it. No one knows how he did it. He had job contractors all over the place building homes in Niskayuna and in the Adirondacks. Needless to say, sometimes his family felt neglected. And so I love that picture. I just think it's, that is Paul looking out at the side of Panther Dam in 1945-46. And how did he do it? How did he muster this coalition? Well, one big factor were the sportsmen of the era. Sportsmen, sportswomen, who were outdoor people, who were hunters, who were fishers. There were clubs all over the state, as you know, hunting and fishing clubs. That's where Paul went first, because he was a hunter and he was a fisher. He related to those clubs, and he went out and spoke to their meetings all over the place. And he got them engaged in this because the Moose River Plains was deer territory. White-tailed deer overwintered and yarded in that country that would have been flooded, that was to be flooded. So he got a lot of support from sporting organizations, but then he expanded it out. Garden clubs were very important. He got the unions involved, people that hunted and fished in their off hours. He got ordinary people who sold cars, who managed grocery stores. It was a really amazing, diverse coalition of folks back in those days, right after World War II. But at its core were those who loved the outdoors and white-tailed deer hunting. To continue, you really need to know or be more familiar, if you're not, with where Paul got this love for the Adirondacks. He grew up in Rotterdam area, Schenectady County, poor. His family were GE related, his father, but they had an inherent love for the outdoors too, his parents. And his mother suffered from all sorts of lung ailments, including asthma, but not just asthma. And like many, she went to Raybrook to take the cure and try to get better. She didn't get better. And her doctors recommended in 1920 or so that she go to the Adirondacks on a more regular basis. And they found this place in Baker's Mills, high above what is now Route 8, which was of course a dirt road, hardly even a dirt road, a dirt track back then. And they settled there and rented for the first 2 years and then bought a place for $200 down in 1923. Paul, by then, he'd born in 1908, was in his teens, and he immediately followed the locals and got to know them and went with them wherever they went to hunt, fish. And of course, many of them were raising stock right there on Edwards Hill Road. You'd never believe it today. It's all woods or second homes or first homes. But back then it was like the country you see behind Paul right now. Paul is in his teens carrying a fishing rod, and behind him is 11th Mountain, which you wouldn't see today at that spot because it's clothed in trees. But it was open country then. But he loved to hunt, fish, guide others. He became a guide for sports from Schenectady and photograph, and he had a skill for writing. He never graduated from high school, but his writing skill was as good as anybody's who went to college. Well, by 1932, Paul was older then had moved on a decade, and he'd been assigned by John Apperson from Schenectady, General Electric Company, whom he met one evening in the winter of 1932 and pledged his allegiance to Apperson's cause, which of course was to preserve Article 14 from logging and from sale of forest preserve and from flooding on Lake George, for example. And he pledged his allegiance, and Appy said, "You really mean it? I mean, you're gonna do what I ask you to do?" And Paul said, "Absolutely." And so Paul was off and running, and by 1932, Appy had assigned him the task of photographing the fires that were raging from the logging operations near Mount Adams. And the slash and burn situation had just taken off, and fires were shooting up Mount Adams and North River Mountain. And Paul was assigned by Appy to take photographic equipment and go up to Mount Marcy and film the smoke that was coming from that direction. And that day, July 15th, 1932, a hot, hot day, the park was on fire, or at least that section of the park. It was an emergency. And who was on that mountain that day? Bob Marshall. I mean, it's amazing. Bob had returned from the Arctic, determined to hike 15 high peaks that day. He started at 4 a.m. Mount Marcy was on his list, and he was, damn determined to hit Mount Marcy and then keep going. And he met this fellow, Paul Schaefer, and they sat down on a rock and started talking. And the emergency behind the threat to the forest preserve in 1932 was enormous. It wasn't just these fires. Bob Moses had proposed the first closed cabin amendment to amend Article 14 to allow all sorts of commercial industry and roads in the forest preserve. The great Bob Moses, who who began the state park system in a serious way. But Moses was no wilderness fan. And so that was the threat. It was on the ballot that year, 1932. My gosh, the number of things that they had to face back then. They didn't have climate change, but so anyway, that was a great meeting, and it was so important to Paul's entire life, this connection to Bob Marshall that they had on July 15th. And the opportunity always meets the prepared, right? Those who are really, really spiritually engaged and passionate and ready and open for new ideas and experiences. And that was Paul Schaefer that day, and Marshall really valued it too. And they had a long correspondence, as Paul did with George Marshall, Bob's brother. Apperson was a big part of Paul's life. He was a mentor to Paul beginning in 32, as I mentioned. And here he is with Appy in 1947. And Appy agreed to help Paul fight the Moose River dams in the winter of 45, 46. They went in for a trip that year in the winter, and it was very, very cold. And Paul got hypothermia. And it hadn't been for a cabin near Beaver Lake. And some of you may know Beaver Lake in the Moose River Plains. There was a private cabin there at that time. And they tried to get a fire going, and they finally got it going. And Paul was very, very close to severe hypothermia. So one of many, Paul's 9 lives. But Appy was a big part of that project. Paul's success in this era and in future was that he joined these essential committees and task forces that existed then in mid-century, and he inserted himself at crucial positions, non-paying. None of this was paid. I mean, this was a legislative committee that Paul helped create, called the Legislative Committee on River Regulation. And the words are key because, again, the Article 14 was amended to allow river regulation, 3% of the forest preserve. And Paul and John Ostrander, pictured on your left, Ostrander was a key member of the New York State Assembly, and they lived close to each other. So they concocted this idea of a committee on river regulation to study the program of regulating rivers statewide and to hold hearings. And this was critical to the whole campaign, 10-year campaign, to provide the evidence that the state was creating hydropower and not the flood control that they espoused. The state was constantly saying, this is for flood control, these dams. Well, they weren't. They were for hydropower. And along the way, that winter of 45, they found this magnificent, there was a stand of white pine in there. They're just awesome in the Moose River Plains. And I went back a few years ago and photographed that same tree into Beaver Lake. Some of you have passed this tree many times, perhaps. Most of those pines are dead now because they already passed their 400, 500 year lifespan. But they're still awesome. ultimately, 10 years on, 1955, there's so much of this story that's in Defending the Wilderness. If you want to know more about it, read Paul's book. But it came down to a final vote of the people, because ultimately there was a small amount of forest preserve and that would be affected by the Panther Mountain Dam. And the legislature had twice allowed the creation of Panther Mountain Dam on two separate legislatures. And this came down to a vote of the public. And as it said in the pamphlet that Paul and his allies created, the people are sovereign. They can, if they desire, follow the fine old injunction of the state constitution that the forest preserve shall be forever wild. It is our hope that they will not alter it. Whatever else may be said against proposed Panther Dam, the fact is that it will be a precedent if it is allowed to be built, a chipping away at one of the precious resources of this state, and will portend the day when New York State Forest Preserve, like so much else of natural grandeur on this continent, is subdued and domesticated. The state's heritage should be handed down unspoiled to future citizens. Wow, that was an editorial in the New York Herald Tribune, 1955. So it came down to the public's vote, and the overwhelming vote, by 1 million votes, the public voted against. Incredibly public and grassroots campaign was successful, and it took a decade. The U.S. Supreme Court, they actually, dam builders and the regulating district and the Water Power and Control Commission wanted to elevate the case, and the Supreme Court said no. So we have a south branch of the Moose River that's still flowing wild out of the Adirondacks. Plains were not flooded. They were acquired for the forest preserve. That was 88,000 acres from the Gould Paper Company. And there's Ice House Pond 50 years after Paul took the photo at the top. Very similar, and still, according to Dan Plumley, who's standing on that log, full of brook trout. Paul met another mentor in 1945, Howard Zahniser, who had just been hired by the Wilderness Society as their first executive secretary. It was all a volunteer operation until then. And Howard professionalized the Wilderness Society and made it his mission to take Article 14 and make that a national campaign for wilderness. In other words, we are where wilderness preservation began in America, thanks to our Constitution. And Howard really took the Constitution to heart. Wherever he went in the United States, he always had a copy of Article 14 in his pocket and always talked about it as the origins of this National Wilderness Preservation Act. And they fought the Black River Wars together. Howard would come and speak on many occasions. But he was much in demand around the country. And as his son likes to write, Ed is very much alive and still goes to the cabin in the Adirondacks that the Zahnisers bought. My father had an unusual tenacity in lost causes. That was the skill he learned in New York State. And so fast forward, the next era, when Paul was in his 50s, they learned a lot from the Moose River campaign, because the next emergency was on the Upper Hudson. We were in a drought period in the United States, and certainly in Eastern New York and Eastern United States, and in the state of New York. The salt front for the intake pipes for New York City's water supply from the Croton Reservoir was creeping up the river because there was so little fresh water flowing down. And so the estuary of the Hudson River was, it was thought by the engineers of that day that, well, the answer lies in the Adirondacks. All we need to do is to put some big dams up in the Upper Hudson, and when the need is needed to flush that salt front south of Poughkeepsie, we'll open the floodgates, and down will come all that beautiful, beautiful Adirondack water to flush out the salt, that wedge of salt in the Hudson. Well, that's that was the threat. The Army Corps of Engineers, of course, was tasked with the engineering, the surveying. And Paul and his allies got to work on the Adirondack Hudson River Committee. And that was the biggest of the many dams that were planned on the Upper Hudson. That's Big Gully, or Gully number 1, as they called it, right where the Indian and the Indian comes in to the Upper Hudson. And the dam would have been just below that confluence, as you can see. And 35 miles north, it would have reached all the way to the visitor center at Rich Lake, and flooded out much of the town of Newcomb. And this looked like a done deal. We had a governor who was a builder named Nelson Rockefeller. And this seemed like a very sensible thing to be doing when you're in a drought and you have to satisfy thirsty New York City, which was truly in a pickle because of the amount of salt that could have entered their intakes. Well, Paul Schaefer et al., Paul found his own engineers. Paul found his own technicians who could look at New York City's water plan and say, it's full of holes. And they don't have to take Adirondack water for this. It's all sorts of things that New York City should be doing to conserve their water supply and to augment it without damming the Upper Hudson. And they produced all sorts of pamphlets. Not only that, they held conferences all over the Adirondacks, including this one in Lake George at the Holiday Inn. Let's preserve the Upper Hudson. It was a packed meeting. I wasn't there. I wasn't totally unaware of what upstate New York looked like in the Adirondacks in 1969. But and some of you may have been there. It was a huge, important, influential meeting. Are we willing to lose the best trout waters and the best winter yarding grounds for deer, shall we? And he went on, Paul went on, the great whitewater canoe country through this its most spectacular river scenery in the east, with another boating, wild, fluctuating mill pond. Shall we drown out miles of fine hiking trails, wilderness campsites, and replace them with a cemetery of stumps and dreary mudflats? You're looking at the Blue Ledges country here. So Paul's committee really got engaged in this one, and it came to a head in April '69. And thank goodness for Republicans, because the Republican Senator Bernard C. Smith from Northport was chairman of the new Environmental Conservation Committee in the legislature, in the Senate. And he got his members in line, and the Assembly got their members in line, and Paul was working them to a fare thee well, all of them, on the phone and in person. And Paul would get down to the legislature early in the morning and wait in line and make his case, as did many others that were part of Paul's coalition. And in April of that year, the state legislature voted to prohibit reservoirs on the Upper Hudson north of Luzerne. Paul wasn't done with the Upper Hudson or with all of these rivers. Instead of fighting these fights that constantly come up, these emergencies, the Moose River, the Upper Hudson, Water Power and Control Commissions, regulating districts, create a Wild and Scenic and Recreational Rivers Act in New York State that had teeth that protected the rivers in statute. So he went about it. And Paul said, we got to be visual. You've got to present your audience with a powerful visual impact of what would be lost if we didn't do this. And he created the film. He hired a filmmaker, Fred Sullivan, to create Of Rivers and Men. It was produced in the early 70s, came out in 72. It was shown to Governor Rockefeller, to Commissioner Diamond, who was the new ENCON commissioner. It was influential with the legislature. They passed the act in 72, and then Governor Carey expanded the system in 1975 after watching the same film. It was that influential. and many of you may have seen that film. It's set to Fred Sullivan's favorite rock and roll music, but it's really good. And today we have the Hudson Gorge Wilderness Area. We just would not have that if these other campaigns had failed. And that's taken from the Polaris Bridge just south of Newcomb. That's both, the left bank is now part of the Hudson Gorge Wilderness Area. Paul at his cabin, and the mountain in the background, far background is Crane, and in the near background is 11th Mountain. And that's the cabin that still stands. And in his Adirondack room in Niskayuna, with the great wall map that he created with volunteers behind him. So this is his country. This is the country he came to love. He became a man here. And whenever he needed to rest and think about things, he came here. And by the time we knew him, he was an elderly man. And we were blessed to know him for almost a decade. And some of you knew him in these years too. And he inspired so many activists who were in their 30s, 20s, and 30s. Here's my friend Dan Plumley from Keene, sitting down with Paul to talk about his latest wilderness adventure. And Paul always bucked us up, made us feel we were doing great things, and kept us going, and gave us projects. The wall map in Paul's Adirondack room, which is now, as you know, the Kelly Adirondack Center, is still there. It's 15 feet tall, 12 feet wide. Started in 1945 as an educational tool so that Paul's activists, Friends of the Forest Preserve, Adirondack Mountain Club, all of these organizations, Isaac Walton League, could understand the Adirondacks better. And the only way they figured out to understand it was to build this great raised relief map. Today, of course, we'd go to our computers for this kind of information, but then they happened to run into a military veteran, came back from the Pacific, and he said, this is what we do. If we need to know a terrain to guide our Navy and our Army in the South Pacific, we build maps like this. And I can show you how to do it. And of course, they used plaster of Paris, and well, it started out with cardboard. And you know how to do these things. And finally, it turns into this mold, and then the positive. And they put the positive against plywood in sections and pieced it together. My God, what a project. And thank goodness for Union College fine arts professor. And I just forgot his name. Wonderful guy. He, in 2005, when we owned the center, Protection of the Adirondacks, he came over and he restored this map for us. And so it'll last a long time, Margie, who is now the caretaker for the center, and thanks to him. The teaching power of the map is awesome. I mean, you could take any number of students, people from all walks of life, and they'll learn more about the Adirondacks gazing at this map and spending time with it than any other way, because it just shows all the waterways, all the lakes, all the mountains and their relationships, the valleys, the glacial history. It's a fabulous thing. There's Paul on the right with his back to you, talking to Governor Cuomo's Environmental Secretary, Joe Martens, and that's me in the background. We all had dark hair then. And Dan Luciano, who was Joe's assistant, on the right. And Paul often met with Joe Martens and Dan, and with their predecessors in other administrations. And he'd invite them over and they'd come over. And they learned a lot from Paul, particularly about how to stick with the program. In other words, think about the long term, not the short term is important too, the emergencies that you have to put out, the fires you have to put out. But Paul always thought, obviously by this time in his life, the longer term issues. And also to dwell on your accomplishments and how they were done, how they were accomplished. By the time we owned the center, we brought students over on the left there and used the center a lot for an educational program. during our ownership before Union College took it over. And Steve Rice, professor of biology at Union College, is on the left, teaching a class, as a ecology course, on how to manage the new acquisition called Boreas Ponds. What was the appropriate wilderness management for this unique 11,000 acre addition to the forest preserve? So Steve pulled out all the maps and he started to talk about, from an ecological point of view, about Boreas Ponds. And given all these ecological factors, how is this area to be managed, classified and managed? And that's what the students are working on this day. And it was a pleasure to work with Steve and with them and use the map as a teaching tool. Boreas Ponds. We put a lot of effort into this wilderness campaign. We thought the entire area should have been designated wilderness. The worst ecological impact that in any wild country is to open up or build a new road. And that road, although it had been used by finch prine, was used relatively lightly. We wanted it to close and to make this a true wilderness area that required some effort to reach the ponds. That was our philosophy. It was not others. And of course, access under Governor Cuomo, recreational access is a big priority. And so ultimately the road is open, as you know, it is washed out many times since the acquisition, but it's open pretty much all the way close to the Boreas Ponds, requiring only less than a mile's walk to the ponds. It's a reasonable compromise, and the Boreas Ponds itself, the ponds you see here in a Carl Heilman photo, is all within the High Peaks Wilderness now, and we're grateful for that. On the APA, the Adirondack Park Agency side, the APA is supposed to design private use, land use and development to be consistent with and in character with the forest preserve. That's the legislative mission, to protect natural resources in this park. And often they end up approving subdivisions around lakes or on mountainsides that just don't meet that definition or that legislative goal at all. This is Woodward Lake. It's near Northville, near Great Sacandaga Reservoir. And it's privately owned. It's about 110 acres, the lake itself, and another 1,000 acres around it of forest. And the subdivider wants to put in 34 homes around this lake and up on the slopes beyond it and build a new road to access some of those new homes. Well, it's a crazy plan. You can't see the diagram below, and some of you may be familiar with this, but it just rings the lake with development. The lake is very shallow, susceptible to pollution. It should be, any development here should be carefully designed on the best soils and clustered, concentrated near the existing road. There is one road on the western side of the lake. So everything should be pulled in close, and the lots should be made smaller. The lots here are 5 to 15 acres. And you can create smaller lots and still maintain privacy in the Adirondacks. But so far, the APA is considering this 34 lots spread all over the place, including all of the resource management land above the lake, split up into separate ownerships, which makes forestry virtually impossible. So there's a lot to be desired here, and Adirondack Wild is really pushing hard for a public hearing. We just issued an action alert, and a number of people have written the APA saying they decry this kind of development in the Adirondacks. No more of this sprawl. It's common outside the Adirondacks. It should not be common inside the Adirondack Park, and we'll see where this goes. We're also advancing legislation that would mandate conservation design of subdivisions on this scale, anywhere in the Adirondacks. So we hope that Mr. Engelbright in the Assembly and his counterpart in the Senate will move that bill forward this year. We believe in the High Peaks that it's reached the point where so many people, the parking lots are exceeded by 2 or 3 times what their design capacity is. And the peaks look like this on some days, at least Cascade does, Cascade Mountain, that we consider a limited entry program into the most heavily trafficked corridors into the High Peaks. This is not a new idea. It's used around the country in wilderness areas. DEC is very reluctant to engage in this a permit program or limited entry program, but I think DEC has the capacity to do it fairly and efficiently, and we're going to continue to push for it. I think it's an idea that's necessary. Once you've exhausted all of your educational and other attempts to manage and maintain this as a wilderness area. Adirondack Wild is guided by our our policy document on the left, Adirondack Park at a Crossroad, a roadmap for action with about 15 recommendations for policy changes in the park to preserve forever wild and actually carry out management appropriate to forever wild. And then Pathways to a Connected Park on the right is a biological treatise about how to plan for the park in a more biologically and ecologically smarter way, including private lands. And that was written by a wonderful conservation biologist, Michael Clemens, with whom we've had a very close working relationship for the past decade. So you can find these on our website, or I'd be glad to mail them to anyone who asks me. I have extra copies. I'd be glad to put hard copies in the mail to you. We participated before the lockdown in Park Environment Day, and we'd like to do more of this once the pandemic ends. This was a very productive day in the legislature with other groups, Adirondack Council, Adirondack Mountain Club, Adirondack Nature Conservancy. I don't think ECOS was involved or formally involved, but some of its members were. And I'm pictured on the left with Skidmore College students who came down for the day and to meet with their legislative aides and with actual legislators to say, we're interested in the future of this park. This park's important. It's a statewide cause to protect the Adirondacks. And so this generation feels that just as keenly as your generation and my generation. And they just need a little guidance and encouragement, like we all do. We were in the field this summer doing as much as we could together and individually. In the top, we're at Bloomingdale Bog, talking about the ecology of this area north of Saranac Lake, and in the below, there's me and Ken Rimini and Terry Jandro, our chairman. Ken is our administrative guru and keeps us honest and keeps us legal and does all of the work, as he says, that Dave doesn't want to do. And our board is so important. There's Suzanne Roberson on the bottom with Ken before the pandemic, meeting at the Kelly Center, and our board meeting in the great room with the map. So we hope to keep this warm relationship with the Kelly Adirondack Center, and Margie Spence, that's absolutely fantastic, allowing us to meet here. So we owe a lot to Paul Schaefer. He was a hunter, a fisher, a campaigner, a home builder, and that aspect of his life could take an entire slideshow. The restoration, the architectural restorations he's done in the Niskayuna and Albany and in the Adirondacks is a key part of his life that gets lost. Oops, I'm sorry. Because I keep talking about his wilderness campaigns. But maybe a biography of Paul will bring out this other aspect to him. But he loved to get out in the wild. And he often said, if I don't get a deer, it doesn't matter. Just doesn't matter. I'm out here. And this was probably his last hunt before his knees gave out around 1988. A snowy November day in the Siamese Ponds Wilderness. And some of you who have hiked Crane Mountain have found this plaque honoring Paul. You have given the youth of the distant tomorrows the opportunity to experience the freedom of spirit and the indescribable happiness found in the solitude of wilderness. Thank you for your tireless effort to keep Adirondack Wild rivers flowing free and the New York State Forest Preserve forever wild. And there's a friend of ours looking up at the plaque as you climb up Crane Mountain. This is on the private land side of Crane Mountain. Thank you, ECOS. It's been a pleasure. If I can answer questions, I'd love to. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was absolutely wonderful and a beautiful presentation. If you can do a stop share, and if everybody can go ahead and turn on your videos and your microphones, and please, let's ask Paul some questions about his presentation and some of those gorgeous pictures he showed us.
I'm honored to be called Paul, but I'm Dave, and talking about Paul.
I'm sorry, Dave. Yes, Dave. I got sidetracked by the plaque at the last moment. That was really cool. So I'm sorry,
I can't hold a
Dave.
candle to him, but I'll answer to his name.
Thank you, Dave.
Dave, I believe Crane was Paul Schaefer's favorite mountain. Is that correct? Is that why the plaque was there?
I think so, Art. Spiritually, obviously, he climbed it many times, but spiritually as well. And yes, the answer is yes.
In part, what would you have thought of the crush of people on the high peaks these days?
No. He would have tried to sort it out, and he would have thought, the first thing to Paul was protect the land. Obviously, as Sennheiser said, we can love this land to death. And, wilderness management, if you don't have the management in wilderness, you're not going to save it. So Paul believed in that too. And he went through the 70s. I mean, many of you remember what Mount Marcy looked like in 1975. And it was a ruin, there was virtually no alpine vegetation left. And the amazing comeback of the tundra vegetation, thanks to the summer stewardship program, it's been absolutely unbelievable.
Where?
The educational power of education on those.
I mean, I heard that the trails were in terrible shape.
So things have gotten better in many ways, but those plants are vulnerable to climate change and the boots as well.
And it's actually helped plant a lot of the alpine flowers up there.
It's Millie. Yep. I saw her before.
Other questions or comments? Love to hear comments as well.
Oh, Dave, what about the Adirondack Northway and Paul?
Yep.
What was he was part of the advocacy for it, I think, right?
Yeah, Paul Schaefer, I just wrote about this for the Adirondack Almanac. 1957, Paul appointed himself. This is what Paul often did. He just showed up. He showed up and he said, I'm going to be the secretary for this or that. And he did. He was named the citizen advisor to the Northway Committee that Governor Harriman created in 1957. And very strong opinions ultimately about where the Northway should be routed. He wanted it out of the Champlain. He thought it was a threat to what would become the Farrow Lake Wilderness. And he said there's a mountain, and he and many others thought there was a mountain route that would work, although you'd have to take a lot of forest reserve, as it turned out, more than 300 acres approximately of forest reserve to build it on the mountain route. Well, the mountain route was the one. Paul was very influential in the routing decision.
That's interesting.
And was in the Adirondack Mountain Club. Dave Newhouse, who is beloved in my memory, because Dave, he worked for the Adirondack Mountain Club for decades, and he also chaired my organization. So he was this bridge between Adirondack organizations. But Newhouse came to me one day and said Paul was in bad odor when it came to the Northway, because the 80K wanted a Champlain Valley route. And it would have made sense. I mean, it was flatter, obviously. Made a lot of sense to buy out the farmers and the agricultural land in the Champlain Valley and take it up that route from Lake George but nope, didn't happen.
Bob Miller here, and one of the other films that Paul did was The Land That Nobody Knows of the Adirondacks, which is kind of hard to find a decent copy of these days. But back in the 60s or 70s, Paul was doing a evening course at Union College. And I was taking that course, and he was showing his class segments of that film while he was still producing it, which was a beautiful film if you ever get a chance to see it.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate those memories, and I was not around in that era, but I often have shown that film on Paul's reel-to-reel projector, and it's now on DVD, of course. And I am, during the pandemic, I can't get to someone who will copy it, but after the pandemic is over, I hope to make more copies of it and make it available to those interested.
Yeah, the copy of it that I have is a very heavily condensed copy of it. The whole film is only a gigabyte long or something like that. It's kind of it's sad to watch because you know that
Adirondack Video Services in South Glens Falls have been great about restoring Rivers and Men and The Land Nobody Knows to the best of their ability, and to keep the color. I mean, the color is deteriorating all the time on these reels.
Right.
And so I hope, I have the master. I just need to get, they need to open up. The pandemic needs to end, and then I can get more copies made.
Yeah.
But yes, it won a Cine Eagle. It was that good. 35-minute documentary, as you say, Bob, went all over the world and
Dave, I lost track of the outcome of the great bicycle path and the elimination of the scenic railroad from Utica up toward Lake Placid. There was a compromise over that, right? I mean, they wanted to get rid of the tracks and have a mountain bike trail all the way up. What did you think of that compromise? You got to unmute yourself, Dave.
Yeah.
Maybe I've been muted this whole time. I'm sorry. The railroad and the management of that state corridor that runs through the park, and the creation of taking out the rails from Tupper Lake to Lake Placid, and that project is started already. The rails are starting to be taken up. The rails will remain from Remsen on up to Tupper Lake. So there are a lot of issues with that whole proposal, Art. But the master plan, state line map plan, was honored. The master plan was amended properly to allow for this bifurcation of the railroad. And I hope it's a good compromise for the people.
Yeah.
Lake Placid, Tupper Lake, and South. We'll see. It's very much, we'll be debating this one for decades to come. Did I answer your question, Art? I mean, there's any number of aspects to it.
Yeah, and I believe that tourist train from Saratoga to North Creek is no longer, right?
That railroad, yeah, the so-called Tahoe's Railroad. Yeah, the future of that is up in the air entirely. Yeah. They're taking still taking tailings out. A man from Tupper Lake has bought the mine, as you know, for the tailings and trucking them out, because those are saleable and useful all over the place. And the rock, but the trucking is far more efficient. And I don't think he's ever going to use the railroad as a working railroad. And finally, New York State has petitioned the federal government to abandon it. And that petition has not been completed yet, or not been honored yet by the Transportation Board in Washington. So we're sitting in abeyance, that project. And no one knows what's going to be the future of that corridor. We're all worried about its mechanization. I don't want to see it mechanized, nor do you. And it'll be another fight in the future, no doubt, or struggle.
Some of the more controversial fights you've been involved in have to do with the preservation of old camps when they change hands and, removing them instead of allowing them to be used for tourists and whatnot. some people, view that as an extremist position and you should be making more reasonable compromises, but you've been consistent with that according to Article 14, they should be removed.
Yes, and the latest is DeBar Lodge, built in 1940 or 1939, north of Saranac Lake, in a very remote area of the Adirondacks, as some of you know. And it sits on the Forest Preserve and has sat there since 1979. And how is it still there? Well, the state has postponed these decisions, as the state will oftentimes defer things. And maintenance fell off, and the roof is in need of work. And it is a beautiful log-faced structure. And some of you have seen it in the media or been there. Our position is that the law, you can't use statutes to preserve it. You need to amend Article 14 to take it out of the Forest Preserve. And a group of architects and preservationists, historic preservationists, want to do just that. They say they only need 6 acres. And in exchange, they're willing to give the state 200 or 300 acres for the Forest Preserve nearby. That seems like a reasonable compromise to me. And we'll see if the legislature bites on that idea. Mm-hmm. In the pandemic, it's very hard to get the legislature to get excited about any constitutional amendment. It's other than the one that just passed, by the way, the right for clean air and clean water did pass. And that's been a project for the last 5 years. So that took some time too to pass. That affects the entire state. So we'll see. But DeBar Lodge is an example of what you're talking about. Santanoni went through this same passionate debate in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Gosh, the passions and the loud voices and the meetings that some of us attended to understand that some of Santanoni needed to be preserved, but not hundreds of acres. You didn't have to recreate the old farm at Santanoni by cutting down a lot of trees that just wanted to grow back. But maintaining the buildings has been a labor of love for the town of Newcomb and for Arch and for so many to maintain Santanoni. It's been so challenging. Money is tight, but they have done it. They have really made buildings for the rest of us. And if we want to just keep going and go into the wilderness, we can do that. Or we can spend some time at Santanoni and think about what it took to live there and to work there in the 1890s and 1900s. And Santanoni, again, did Santanoni get, it's sitting on the Forest Preserve. Maurice Hinchey, some of you remember, was the genius that said, okay, I'm going to pass one bill that will preserve Santanoni by statute. And he did, and it's still part of the environmental conservation law. And that's what the DEC hung their hat on, to keep the buildings standing while during the time when historic preservation, when you're faced with an emergency, things happen. And the unit management plan was passed in 1998, 99. It was a good compromise. And I was there when it was made a national landmark. And in part, I was influenced by Paul, Art, because Paul never saw any good, beautiful historic restoration and wilderness. Those two were entirely compatible in his mind because he was so skilled at both. And, you just pick your spots, right? And Paul got behind, for example, the saving of Sagamore in Great Camp in Racket Lake. And that was done by constitutional amendment. That was the right way to go about it. And the people at DeBar Lodge further north hope that example is replicated.
Any other questions?
I just want to thank Cindy. You've been so good. And Art, Cindy, your tutorial was essential for me. Thank you.
I was glad to be able to do it, and we're just so grateful that you joined us, Dave. And we hope
Anytime.
that we'll have some return for our next speaker series. Margie has arranged for us to have a couple of students present on some projects that they had presented in the past. So it kind of tags off what you've been doing, Dave, and you might even want to join us and listen into what some of those young up and comings have to share with us.
Like
Yeah, are there any, I don't want to cut anybody off. Are there any further questions? All right, well, again, thank you, Dave. That was absolutely wonderful and beautiful. I enjoyed every minute, as I'm sure we all did. There's clapping, yay! And we're so grateful to have the opportunity to have such knowledgeable speakers, even when we can't get together face to face. So again, we're very grateful. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great evening. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk, and Cindy for doing it, putting it all together. Great job.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Did you eat? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good. I thought, like, oh my God, I mean, 'cause I just started eating all this chicken, my chicken